Okay, so let's jump in to flash or strobe versus ambient or constant light. This is the primary foundation because you need to understand the differences between these two types of light sources. Now, let's start simply from number one. Okay, visibility to the eye. A flash or a strobe is only visible for the split second that is turned on, okay, for the split second that it fires. So that is the primary difference between a strobe versus constant light, okay? One, we can see it's visible to the eye. The other one isn't. A strobe is not, okay, unless it's firing. And you can see it when it's firing, but not other times. Now, what about this? What about these terms? Okay, so flash or a strobe. What is that? Well, all that defines is simply basically the power of the flash. But all these are the same thing. So let me show you for example. Generally with this guy, the LP180, small flashes like this, we call flashes or we call pocket strobes. Now larger flashes like this guy, this is an Einstein 640 watt second. This is a studio flash, which we refer to as a studio strobe or a full strobe or a strobe or whatever you want to call it. But typically these are called strobes. Typically these are called flashes. The lights operate the exact same. The only difference between these two lights is just that this puts out more power. Okay, that's the primary difference. This will put out maybe 6, 7, 8 times the amount of power that this little guy will. But of course, this isn't that convenient. It has to be plugged into the wall, or you have to have a self-contained battery that you take along with you. It's larger, it's heavier, and so forth. So while you get more power, you also require a lot more. We're gonna be talking more about these guys in lighting 201 and 301. But for now, let's focus on kind of the on-camera flash or the pocket strobe. Now I wanted to show this guy just to show you that there's all sorts of strobes that kind of go in between as well. This is the Bolt VB22. So with this guy, this is kind of an in-between flash or pocket strobe, whatever you want to call it. But basically it puts out more power than a pocket strobe like this flash right here, the LP180. It puts out more power than that guy, maybe 3 to 4 times more power. But it puts out less power than the large studio strobe. The difference being is that this is a little bit more convenient, it's a little more portable. It still has its own kind of separate battery pack, which makes it less convenient than a pocket strobe, but it makes it more convenient and more portable than a studio strobe. So there's tons of different flashes on the market, each with different kind of various functions and so forth, but primarily they all operate the exact same way. They put out light for an instant of a second, and then they remain off. These are strobes. All right, constant lights or ambient light. Now, basically, when you walk into a room, if you like the way that the light looks in that room, oftentimes I would say, ooh, I love the ambient light. Ambient light is composed of really anything or any type of constant light. Like we mentioned, these are constant lights. These are constant lights. The sun is a constant light. So if you like ambient light, you simply like the existing light in a scene, which is made up of constant lights. Why? Because we can see them constantly. Okay, so we understand that. Let's talk about point number 2, which is the light intensity. This is another major difference between strobe versus constant lights. For the size of the actual light in comparison to the light output, you get far, far, far more light intensity, more power out of this guy than you would out of this guy. This is a light panel chroma, okay? So I can turn this guy on right here. And it's fantastic. It's wonderful for lighting indoor sets, for lighting in scenes that are a little bit darker. It's great for that, okay? It has varying power levels and so forth. But if I took this outdoors in midday sun, you would not even be able to see this. I mean, if you brought it like maybe 1 inch away from the subject, yeah, it might work as a fill light, okay? If it was super close, it would be a fill light. But a simple pocket strobe like this LumiPro LP180, this can actually overpower the sun. Now it can only overpower the sun for a split second, okay? For that fraction of a second that it's firing, which means that we can do all sorts of creative things. In this shot right here, you see us brightening up our model, and we're not even using it directly, we're actually bouncing it. If we used it directly, we can even brighten her up more. But we're brightening up the model so that she has the same kind of exposure, the same brightness as midday sun. All right, let's move on to point number 3, which is the white balance. Now, the white balance for ambient or constant lights, it varies, okay? So for this light, for example, the light panel chromas, the ones that we have on set that we're using to light the set, they have varying light temperatures. So what you see right now, this is daylight white balance, so it looks probably really blue to you guys. But I can actually warm this up. I can warm it up by adding in a little bit of tungsten to it. And so we can get anywhere in between where we have kind of this, tungsten daylight mixture, which is probably around 4,200 degrees Kelvin. And we can also warm it up down to like around 3,600 degrees Kelvin with using only the tungsten light. These types of lights, LED light panels, generally they vary in temperature, which is fantastic because you can use them to match the temperature of whatever scene that you're shooting within. Other types of constant lights, they might not vary. They might just be set at a certain, basically, temperature. We're going to talk about this in more detail later on. But for example, these lights in the background, these tungsten lights, they come basically at that temperature. We can't change it. And that's probably around like say 2,800 degrees Kelvin. So it's a very yellow, very warm light. Other lights like the sodium kind of fluorescent light, they're going to be more green and so forth. But flashes, these are a little bit different. Regardless of what kind of flash you buy, whether it's a pocket strobe, whether it's a studio strobe, whether it's somewhere in between, every flash is going to come defaulted at around 5,500 degrees Kelvin. We would modify this light color by adding what we'd call a gel to it. And again, we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But otherwise, they're basically going to always fire at 5,500 degrees Kelvin, which is right around that midday sun color temperature. One small interesting note, depending on the quality of the flash, it's going to give you a certain consistency in the light color, okay? So the light color and the output actually. But for example, a nice flash might always give you a flash that's in between 4550 degrees Kelvin and 4450, between 4550 Kelvin, meaning it's a 100-degree variance between flashes, or it might be even more precise. A less expensive flash might have a 400 to 800-degree variance between fires. So when you shoot, it's going to be a little bit different in colors. Now, for most people, you're not going to notice a huge difference. But if you're a professional photographer and you're relying on power and color consistency, that's one thing to note, is that a higher quality flash will give you better consistency as far as output, power output, and also the color temperature between shots. Okay, so just one quick note there. Last thing I wanted to mention is the camera exposure. Okay, the fourth difference between strobe versus constant light is that the camera exposure is going to vary just a little bit. Some things stay the same, but some things will actually vary. And the reason why is because, like we talked about, strobes only put out light for 1,000th of a second, okay? A fraction of a second, which means that if my shutter speed is set to 1/200th of a second, if it's set to 1/10th of a second, if it's set to 10 seconds, it doesn't matter, because the amount of light coming out of this strobe is always going to be the same in that period the shutter is open. And that creates kind of differences in the way that flash is exposed versus constant light. Because as we know with constant light, however long the shutter is open, well, that determines how much light is going to come in. And we're going to discuss that in more detail as we go through. We want to really hammer this point home. So let's go ahead and move to the next video now.